You're listening to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast, a podcast which features students and early career professionals who work in the alternative protein industry, where they discuss their journeys and deliver advice on how you can start a career in this revolutionary field. It is well understood that science jobs are needed in the alternative protein industry. But what about the social sciences? Well, in this episode, I explore the key role that social science plays in furthering the development of the alternative protein industry through my conversation with Chris Bryant, who is the Director of Bryant Research, a UK-based research organization focused on shaping better food choices through social science. We discuss how to transition from academia to the industry, the perceptions of cultivated meat and other alternative proteins, and how it differs across cultures, in addition to the skills needed to develop into a role in the social sciences. Okay, let's dive in. Welcome, Chris, to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast. It is so lovely to have you on the show today, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks very much for having me, Jeffrey. Looking forward to it.
All right, as a starting off question, why did you decide to pursue a career in the alternative protein industry?
Yeah, well, I, like many people in the industry, am primarily an animal person. I've been vegetarian for about 10 years and I've been vegan for about 3 years. And I realized that I can't be the only person who has given up meat but is not that happy about it. And so I was very reluctant vegetarian when I first made the transition. And, I totally recognized that it's basically very nice eating meat. It's a nice, tasty experience. Can provide you with some nutrients. It's very convenient. It's very difficult to avoid meat for some people. And so really we need to do what we can to make that transition easier. And I eat a lot of meat alternatives. I think that it's important to develop these products to be as good as they can be to push that mission forward.
Awesome. Yeah, and I totally agree. Meat is something that is difficult for a lot of people to give up. So how did you get into the alternative protein industry and what led you to where you are now?
Yeah, well, when I had first gone vegetarian, shortly thereafter, I came across the concept of cultured meat. And really, I was quite struck by this idea because I realized that this was a way of having our cake and eating it, a way to allow people to carry on eating meat and have all of the good parts of that they value and not have all of the bad parts of that, which actually most people would agree it's not great, that this is a great driver of climate change, of antibiotic resistance, and a great cause of a great deal of animal suffering. Most people don't really want those things to be part of their food. And so when they have an opportunity to get the parts of their food which they like and exclude those parts which they don't like, that seemed like a very good deal to me. At the University of Exeter, where I did my undergraduate degree, we hosted Professor Mark Post, who came and gave a talk about cultured meat. And then I further studied cultured meat on my master's and went on to do a PhD in psychology, where I was looking at public perceptions of cultured meat. And so, yeah, it was very much from an academic angle. And then since finishing my PhD a few years ago, I've been consulting in alternative proteins and animal protection as well. So I work with cultured meat companies still and a variety of different plant-based and fermentation-based companies as well. So very much from the academic angle, and I work in social science research. So that's kind of how I got into the field.
Ah, okay. That's a really unique pathway into the field. So what do you think are some of the reasons people might be hesitant towards cultivated meat?
One of the biggest things that we see is people have a kind of intuition that this is something unnatural and therefore there might be some kind of problem with it on that basis. So some people are perceiving cultured meat as unnatural and then inferring that there must be some kind of health problems or environmental problems that stem from that unnatural status. And some other people seem to have a kind of worldview where just unnatural equals bad and natural equals good, and that's kind of the end of it. I don't think that either of those really hold up to scrutiny. For example, we can think about many heavily processed foods, things like supplements and multivitamins, which are healthy for us and are recommended for optimal health in many cases. And we can also think of many naturally occurring foods like red meat, for example, which is known to be linked to a number of deadly diseases. Of course, we have many foods which occur in nature, things like wild mushrooms and berries, which are completely natural, but one dose could be deadly to a person. So I think that is the basis of a lot of people's uncertainty with cultured meat specifically, and to a lesser extent with plant-based meat as well, that something about it being a deviation from nature and or processed must have some kind of bad implications. But I think it's not necessarily the case in reality, but it is something that is a widely held kind of intuition, and therefore something that we really have to contend with.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective about how people perceive naturalness of certain foods. I'm sure you've done a lot of research onto this, and I'm keen to learn more about some of the work that you're doing at Bryant Research.
Well, we work, as I mentioned, with cultured meat companies and also with plant-based meat companies and other alternative protein producers. And we also work with animal protection nonprofits and other groups which are in the alternative proteins and kind of meat replacement space. So what we do is offer social science consulting, and that can be things like public opinion polling, social experiments, things like A/B testing of different product names and branding, and also broader social analysis. So we've been doing a lot of policy analysis and things of that nature recently. Really anything in social science which is moving the ball forward for alternative proteins and the protein transition.
Right, okay. So prior to Bryant Research, you got your PhD. So I was wondering, how did your experience of getting your PhD lead you to start Bryant Research? And did you find it difficult to get into the industry with having only a purely academic background?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, not really. I think that this is a field that quite values science, and really many people who are my clients have found me through my various publications on the topic. So I've not really ever gone looking for work as such, but rather, different organizations will contact me and say, found your paper on this, we read your paper on that, and would you be interested in working together? So I had a couple of clients who I was working with kind of alongside my PhD towards the end, based on some research that I had done in the early days. And really, I didn't ever imagine that I would quite pull off being self-employed to the extent that I have. I had a couple of clients that I was working with towards the end of my PhD and kind of carried on working with them. And I started to realize that this is something that I could expand and offer to others in the industry. And I'm very happy to be working in this industry in general. And so, yeah, when I realized that I was able to generate some value for a bunch of different players in this field, I was very happy to keep on doing that. And gradually I formalized that into what is now Bryant Research.
Yeah, that's amazing how it just sort of formed itself, really, based on some of the people that you worked with during your PhD, and now it's turned into its own business.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that one great thing about spending time in academia and doing a PhD or doing some other kind of long-term academic research in a niche is that you can become an expert on a certain topic at quite an early stage. And if you do that successfully and have a couple of well-cited papers, then people will have heard of you and will come to you with opportunities. I'm sure that there is a degree of luck in which papers kind of tend to catch on and get cited and so on. But yeah, certainly I've found that for me, my scientific publications have really helped to get my name in front of people who are in a position to employ me as well.
You make it sound like it was fairly easy, but I imagine that it was more difficult. So, what were some of the challenges that you faced in starting up Bryant Research?
My undergraduate degree was in business, so I knew a thing or two about how to run operations and price things, and I knew a bit about the business side of things. And so I think I was in quite a good position to transition into being self-employed and having a business. And then obviously the later stages of my academic career were more on the research side. And so kind of combined the research and the business elements of that. I'm still discovering new challenges and working through them as I go along. There are certainly some interesting features of being in a hybrid between industry and academic research.
So I want to transition a little bit here to more talking about the social sciences of alternative proteins. And I'm curious to know why you think social sciences are so important for the alternative protein industry, and if you feel that this is a highly neglected aspect of the industry.
It continues to astound me, really, how the hard science can be, on some level, easier to get right than the social sciences. I very much look up to anybody who is a food technologist or a cellular biologist or anything of that nature who is working in alternative proteins. And certainly there's a lot of stuff that those people know, which is far beyond my understanding on that side. It's interesting how in many domains we seem to be able to come up with the technical solutions before we can come up with the social solutions. It might be easier to crack the code for making price parity indistinguishable cultured meats, for example, than to get the most stubborn consumers to want to eat it. And I think that there is always a difficult to quantify and difficult to pin down element when it comes to the social sciences, and there's always more to understand. I think that one thing to consider here is that the shape of our institutions and the shape of the world ultimately really comes down to the preferences of individuals. And so I think it's very important to understand those preferences and understand how to communicate things in a way which leads to preferences which lead to a good state of the world. So, for example, governments can do what they can do and set the laws and priorities that they will. But in democratic countries, they're ultimately beholden to voters. And so a government can't, for example, just outlaw factory farming tomorrow if all of the people want cheap animal products, because they're just going to vote for the other party. And similarly, big companies, if we think about supermarkets, for example, a supermarket can't just stop selling factory farmed meat tomorrow if most of the consumers want cheap meat, because they'll just go to another supermarket. And so it can appear from the individual's perspective that there are these giant institutions which hold so much of the sway, and that what individuals prefer or do doesn't have that much of an impact. But ultimately, all of those big institutions are beholden to and made up of individuals. And so understanding how individuals come to have their preferences and how they might be able to be influenced, I think is really key to kind of shaping the kind of world that we would hope to create.
Yeah, and on the note of preferences, have you noticed any preference differences between different cultures or regions?
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to be that certain parts of Asia are very progressive when it comes to alternative proteins. So there are parts of India, for example, which have very, very high rates of vegetarianism, highest rates in the world, and relatively high acceptance in China and especially in Singapore of cultivated meat and other kinds of alternative proteins. It seems that Europe in particular is a little bit further behind on that front. There are some more kind of conservative and conventional consumers who are a little bit harder to persuade towards new kinds of food. And I think that's starting to be reflected in the different levels of regulatory approval that we're seeing around the world. So Singapore, of course, is the only country currently to have approved the sale of cultivated meat. The US is looking like it's not far behind, but it could still be some time in Europe before companies are approved to sell their products here. So there definitely does seem to be some kind of intercontinental differences in attitudes towards alternative proteins on an individual level. And I think that's also starting to be reflected on the government level as well.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I think on a personal level, like it's going to change between different people. And maybe it's not just different cultures, but maybe differences between genders or ethnicities or social status. I'm not sure if you've noticed any differences between other factors.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing that we see with respect to adoption of new products in general is that it tends to be younger people who are more likely to be innovators and early adopters of new innovations. And, you'll see that in food technology and you'll see it in other areas of technology as well. it tends to be the case that really the older we get, the more likely we are to have arrived at ways that we like doing things and be a bit more reluctant to depart into new ways of doing things. So typically we do see that younger people are more likely to be some of the innovators. There are some other dimensions where they kind of diverge with respect to different forms of alternative proteins. So, for example, vegetarian or kind of flexitarian and leaning consumers are more likely to be finding plant-based meat alternatives to be more appealing, whereas the reverse is true for cultivated meat, and we see quite high appeal to heavy meat eaters. So I think there is a bit of differentiation in that sense in the markets for these products, and I think that it could be the case that cultivated meat, for example, comes to appeal more to more stubborn consumers who have not yet adopted plant-based meat, and we see in the data that the markets for those products overlap not quite imperfectly. So there's space for people who would eat one but not the other.
Oh,
Yeah, a lot of times vegetarians and vegans recognize the benefits of cultivated meat and like that it doesn't contain animals. And so they might be more likely to agree that it's a good thing in the abstract, but they're actually less likely to want to eat it themselves.
yeah, it's fascinating.
One big thing which is quite interesting, there seems to be a common misconception amongst advocates for eating less meat, this idea that you mustn't talk about animal suffering, that is somehow taboo and will put people off your cause and so on. Actually, the data suggests that talking about animal cruelty on factory farms is amongst the most compelling things that you can do. It's going to capture a higher percentage of people who intend to change their diet compared to talking about environmental or health issues. It's also going to have people change their diet to a greater extent, so going vegetarian or vegan completely, as opposed to cutting down on their meat consumption. And it's also going to have people maintain their dietary change for a longer time. People, if they're changing their diet for environmental or health reasons, they might be less motivated to stick with it into the future. I think that as advocates for eating less meat and eating fewer animals, we do need to be brave about not shying away from the message of animal cruelty as a key reason that we want people to move in this direction. The evidence suggests that that's a pretty effective thing to talk about in terms of persuasion.
All right. And for people that we've already persuaded through this podcast to get into the alternative protein industry, what advice do you have for them?
I think it's a really cool industry to work in, partly because it is also new. Many fields that you would think about going into, really it takes a lifetime to become an expert in something that's very established. But with fields as new as this, there aren't that many people who are experts on these topics and who have been doing this for 30 years. These fields didn't exist 30 years ago. I think it's a great thing to go into relatively new fields because you can progress quite quickly and become a subject matter expert sooner than you could in other fields. So I think that's a great benefit. I'd say that it's never too early to start doing the job that you want to do, basically. I think that's good advice within companies. If you start taking on the responsibilities of some job that you would like to have, then when the person who does that job moves on, then you'll be the person who already knows how to do a lot of those things. And it's certainly true kind of within industries as well. If you start making things happen and taking the initiative to put things out there, work with other people in the field, try and create things and make things happen, that will be noticed, and you'll find that you are creating opportunities for yourself, usually I would say on a larger scale than it seems when you're doing the thing. Of course, there's a degree of luck in terms of how these things fall, but generally, if you start agitating and making things happen, that's going to massively increase your chances of success in any field.
Yeah, that seems like a logical approach. If you want to get into something, just taking on a little more of those responsibilities.
Yeah, as you have done, nobody told you to start this podcast. So I think that's a great example. You've taken the initiative and are doing it. And I think it's very likely that this will become something valuable. So yeah, good work to you, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thank you. And sometimes you just have to take some risks as well.
For sure.
So what types of skills are needed for someone in your role? So if someone wanted to follow in your footsteps, what skills should they start to develop?
Yeah, good question. So on the research side, pretty much as much quantitative and kind of mathematical and statistical exposure and experience as you can get at the early stages. I think that will really pay dividends. It is something that's difficult to do and to do well. And so if you're the person who knows how to do that, you'll find that is a rare and a valuable skill. That's something that's definitely worth developing. And writing as well, I think, is the other part of that. Being willing to have your first draft be imperfect, I think, is a great skill and something that will enable you to overcome a lot of writer's block, basically. If you abandon the idea that the first time you're writing the thing, it has to be spot on, it will enable you to write with much more freedom. So writing well and extensively and having a good understanding of statistics and numbers in general on the research side. And then on the business side, I think that there is a lot to be said for communication, really, and understanding people. Often when I work with clients, there is kind of a difference between what they might be looking for and then how things would normally be done in purely academic research. And so that's something that I've learned over time to identify where those differences might be and help to really build in the beneficial parts of the academic process for my client projects, but then also have that research be expressed in ways that the clients and the businesses can understand. And that can sometimes be quite different from how you might express things in an academic publication. So, for example, in academic research, there's a lot of inferential statistics, t-tests and regressions and p-values and all the rest of it, which really is quite alien to most people outside of academia. And so if you're showing them those kinds of outputs, they're not going to understand what you're talking about, basically. So having an awareness of that and a bit of finesse in navigating the differences between those things, I think, is a valuable skill. So I guess that's something like understanding other people, listening to other people, understanding their requirements, and then a bit of creativity to try to cater to that.
Yeah, I can see creativity being a really important part of that role. And going back to the point about not having your first draft be perfect, one of my mentors said to me that you should always be embarrassed of your first version.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And, you'll see that even if you watch long-running TV shows, for example, the early series are generally much more clunky and less developed than the later series. It's kind of evident that the writers and the directors and actors and everyone else involved has developed their ideas of what the project should be and what it should look like and how to do it well. Yeah, I mean, I think it's true of anything in life. The first time that you do something is going to be the worst, basically, that you'll ever be at doing it. And having the confidence and the self-awareness to embrace that to some extent and to say, look, I've got to start doing this and I'm going to develop and become better at it in the future. Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Yeah, exactly. You can only get better from there.
Absolutely. And you can't get better without starting at that bad stage, which is the hard part to accept, I think, in taking up anything new.
Yeah, very true. So, do you have any resource recommendations for people interested in this industry?
Yeah, there are associations in most countries for cellular agriculture now. There's Cellular Agriculture UK, Cellular Agriculture France, Germany. So if that's your field, then it's definitely worth reaching out to those groups. There are well-known non-profits that work in these spaces. The Good Food Institute is a massive one in alternative proteins. Also ProVeg, New Harvest. There are organizations that you can contact and they'll be able to provide you with resources, and also they may be able to provide you with internships and that kind of thing. I would also recommend, if you are a researcher, looking at the RECAP group, which I helped to organize, that's research to end consumption of animal products. You can find us at recapresearch.org. We have a Slack group and a monthly Google Meet where we share resources, form collaborations, and also share our research findings with each other. So yeah, that's recapresearch.org if you are interested in joining RECAP.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing those, and I'll include links to those in the show notes.
Awesome.
Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss?
I would just say, I'm sure that you are certainly aware of this, and a lot of your listeners will be aware of this already. I think alternative proteins and reduction of animal products more broadly really is an essential issue which affects so many different important global issues: climate change, antibiotic resistance, pandemics, and a massive amount of animal suffering. These are all things which are tied up in our current food production system. I don't think there really are many other fields that affect quite so many important issues quite so severely. And so if you are interested in alternative proteins and you're thinking about working in this field, I think you're barking up the right tree. This is an important part of the solution to so many of today's important global problems.
Yeah, very well said.
And yeah, good on you, Jeffrey, for taking the initiative to start this up and helping people get into the field. I think it's a fantastic thing that you're doing.
I really appreciate that, and it's been such a delight to have you on the show, and I want to thank you for sharing your experiences and insights.
Real pleasure talking to you, Jeffrey. Thanks so much for having me on.
Based on this episode, it should be clear that social science is just as important to grow the industry, which further shows how there's a place for everyone, including you, to be a part of the alternative protein revolution. If you want to learn more about careers in the alternative protein industry, please follow the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast on Instagram for weekly posts about episode releases, alternative protein resources, job boards, career advice, and so much more. Also, I highly recommend that alternative protein job seekers connect with Pia Volz, the founder of Catalyst, on LinkedIn, as she regularly posts updates and resources related to the alternative protein industry.